Hi folks, you're with Tastus today at your Pushback channel. Thank you for joining this live stream. Today I'd like to talk about the situation in Australia regarding the COVID lockdowns, the response of the various state governments in Australia, and of course this has got international coverage, and just examine what's going on here, how it happened, where it's at now, and possibly where it's going. And let's just go down that path and see what we can do in terms of putting that story together. And a few subscribers have come to me and said, look, can you talk about this? So maybe it's the right thing to do, to have a chat about this. I wasn't going to go near it actually, given the controversy, but I'll do this vid here. Before I get into that, so a group that's doing some very good work and covering these lockdowns and what's going on in Australia in some good detail and putting a lot of work into it is Rebel News. And the guy who's been covering it from the outset here is Avi Yemeni, and that's spelled A-V-I, I think, Y-E-M. INI, Avi Yemeni at Rebel News. If you do a search on that, you'll find Avi, and he's been posting a lot of videos, and well worth a look. So I suggest you if you want to round out your understanding of what's happening here, then that's definitely a place to go to. So just a quick history lesson on Australia and how Australian governments are structured, because there's a lot of misunderstanding out there as to the role of the federal government, the state governments, and who does what and why and how. So I need to just cover that a little bit. It'll give you some understanding. Now, Australia is the world's biggest island at almost 2,500 miles wide. That's close on 4,000 kilometres and 2,000 miles long north to south. So the Dutch traders sailing in and out of their trading port in Batavia, which is modern-day Indonesia in Java, first landed in Australia in the 1600s, but they found it arid and dry, and there's nothing really of worth to see or to gather. So they didn't come back, and they weren't interested in it. In 1699, William Dampier, an English explorer, also mapped part of the Australian west coast, just a little bit further south of where the Dutch had been. But again, wasn't overly excited by it all. But it was in 1770, an English navigator and cartographer, that's a guy who draws maps, someone of exceptional skill, Captain James Cook, mapped much of the Australian east coast. So the Dutch and everything were on that west coast. So going 2,500 miles over to the east, Captain Cook mapped most, not all, but most of the Australian east coast. But it took in areas that later on would become Sydney and Brisbane and so on. So that was all mapped by Captain Cook in a voyage that went around the world, and he made maps on other things, and also did things like looking at the planets and so on. He was eventually killed by and eaten by Hawaiian cannibals years later. In 1788, the British decided to make Australia a convict colony. I guess there's a little story to that. The agricultural revolution was happening in Britain at the time, which means a lot of people were being displaced from the country, were moving into the city. But this was before the Industrial Revolution had really taken off. So you have large mobs and crowds of people roaming around the cities such as London, and with not much to do. And they're hungry, they're stealing food and stealing all sorts of things, and worse than that, of course. But that put the British government decided, well, gee whiz, with all these criminals running around, we need a place to send them. So let's send them to this place in Australia. So off they went. Now, Captain Cook had stopped in a little bay just south of Sydney, which he called Botany Bay, and so they were heading for Botany Bay with a number of ships and many convicts on the ships. There was another side as well for the convicts. There were some that were just labourers, but they tended to, the courts tried to pick people, particularly people with skills, such as carpenters or anything like that. So they were they were picked up and offered the opportunity. Well, look, you can go to Australia for 7 years, or you can spend 7 years in prison. What do you want to do? So a lot of them, of course, picked the option of going to the convict colony. So they had an unusual number of skilled people, skilled convicts there. Similarly, for the labouring, it was a prison sentence for stealing half a loaf of bread, for example. So there were some people who were coming here you'd hardly call hardened criminals. So the first fleet arrived in January 1788. They found Botany Bay unsuitable, so they moved just a little bit further north, a few miles north, into another bay, which of course became the bay for Sydney, Australia's biggest city. The rest of Australia was settled thereafter, and some were penal settlements, others were populated by free settlers, so there was a mixture there. The last convict arrived in Australia more than 150 years ago. In 1901, the Australian colonies federated into a nation with its own government. Now, technically, the Queen or the British monarch is still the head of state, but it's a very ceremonial position. They don't really have any power. The political power rests with the Australian elected parliaments, the state parliaments, and of course the federal parliament and the federal prime minister. Technically, there's a Governor General in Australia, and technically the head of state, representing the Queen, can do things like dissolve the parliament, but they can only do it if they have to call an election. So the powers are very limited and used very sparingly. Australia has 8 state or territory governments. They're headed by what's called a premier, which is kind of like a governor, or you would see in the United States, by a premier or chief minister. There are 2 territories and 6 states. The territories are like young junior states that really don't have the population to justify statehood. Now, these states, whether it be territories or states, the COVID responses are decided by these state governments. It's not a federal matter. The federal government will do things like buy vaccines, for example, from overseas. They'll handle that side of it. But the on the ground measures to deal with COVID and the lockdowns, well, that's all a state matter. So the rubber bullets that you're seeing on some of the footage that's gone around the world, the police beating up on protesters, and which is unbelievable, by the way. I can scarcely believe it's Australia that I'm in when I see that sort of footage. And also things like pepper spray and smoke bombs and the like. That was the state of Victoria, where Melbourne is the main city. And with a premier that's probably the most pro-globalist out of all the premiers. So no surprise at the behaviour that's going on there. Also the flagrant disregard for the law, in my view, and the Constitution. Now, on the basis that COVID was a disastrous and an incredibly lethal pandemic, the state parliaments, that's all the elected members and all the representatives of the various districts, they voted emergency powers to the state executive branch of the government. So these emergency powers were voted on a six monthly tranches. So now, a lethal pandemic is one that kills otherwise fit and healthy people and kills them in large numbers. The bubonic plague is an example of that. A pandemic that kills 1 in every 500 people, and even then folks that are already in poor health or in their 90s and that sort of thing, is viewed by many as failing comprehensively to meet the criteria for a deadly pandemic, and thus for the invocation of the emergency powers. The emergency powers are needed for a serious matter, not something like this. So we have to question why the emergency powers were voted in. The constitutional definition of what constitutes an emergency is rather vague. It was clearly assumed by the framers of the Constitution that the body politic, the politicians, the Premier and so on, would act sensibly and in good faith and solely in the interests of the populace. But the framers lived in times when governments were sovereign and they reported to the voters, not to the globalist cabal. For reasons, therefore, that most voters cannot understand, and frankly, I don't understand it, the elected members of parliament have voted the first emergency powers of 6 months, and you kind of cut them some slack. They didn't really know back then whether COVID was going to really turn into something big or not. So cut them some slack there. The first 6 months maybe was justified. I don't think so, but maybe it was. But since then, they voted two more tranches of 6-month emergency powers. Now, these emergency powers come very close to suspending the Constitution. Think of Abraham Lincoln in the American Civil War suspending the writ of habeas corpus. We're talking really, dimensions approaching that. But importantly, while they have these emergency powers, there is no oversight of what they do. There's no judicial oversight. There's no political oversight. They can act and do as they please. And therefore, emergency powers must be only granted under exceptional circumstances of a real emergency, not something that kills 1 in 500 people, again, who are already ill. The emergency powers are extensive, but in the event of a real emergency, they kind of have to be, so I get that. But we're talking apocalypse type stuff, famine, military invasion, the real Black Death, bubonic plague, those sorts of things. And in times of that, there would be mass panic, and therefore emergency powers are appropriate. But only then, not outside of that. Instead, however, these emergency powers are not being used to deal with an emergency. There is no emergency to deal with. Instead, these emergency powers are being used in a political sense to crush dissent and to ride roughshod over the Constitution and to ride roughshod over the rule of law and to ride roughshod over due legal process, to politicise the courts, to politicise the police, to politicise the security services. It's not good. Quite clearly, all Western governments are acting in near perfect concert. They're uttering the same talking points. They're shilling the same doubtful statistics, and they control all the means for statistics. We don't know when they say there's been 500 cases of the pandemic. We don't know that's accurate. They control the testing, the assembly of information, and so on. So it may not be 500. It may be 1 or 2. I mean, we just don't know. Given they control that information, then we've got to be dubious over those statistics. In my view, they're doubtful. There is no question the globalist cabal is directing the traffic here. All the Western countries are pretty much operating a lockstep and doing crazy things like there's one alleged case, and so they lock down the whole country, that sort of thing. No sane person would do that unless they were directed to do so. Moreover, the globalist-controlled media is all for it. They cheer it on. In fact, if they want tougher measures that shouldn't apply to them, by the way, measures that only have to apply to other people. Most disturbing is how the various state governments have treated any dissent or even any questioning. And keep in mind, these are the people that are protesting and so on. They've lost their businesses, they've lost their livelihoods, they've lost their savings. They have every right in this so-called democracy we're supposed to live in to know why, and if it was worth it, what the real reasons are for locking down so hard and creating such hardship for so many people. Any dissent, particularly in Victoria, in the city of Melbourne, any dissent is treated with previously unseen heavy-handedness. Police search and apprehend squads that look, if you look away, these guys, these search and apprehend squads walk around, looks like they've got military training. They don't look like police goons. They look like they've had military training. The way they walk, stand, that enter the crowd to grab someone and take them out, that sort of thing. So police search and apprehend squads arbitrarily target and arrest private citizens who have committed no crime. Rubber bullets and pepper spray, I think we've all seen the footage there, are used, and this seems to be so over the top relative to the situation at hand that it's hard to believe it's even going on. Contrast this, however, with the far more disruptive climate change protests and BLM protests. Those people, whether they're wearing masks or not, whether they're flouting health orders or not, the police treat these folks comparatively with kid gloves. And judges, jurists in supposed courts of law, let them off with a slap on the wrist. Even multiple offenders are just getting a $20 fine. Now contrast this with the very rough, very hard treatment that's being given to people who oppose or question the lockdowns. Some of these people have been grabbed off the street and given 30 days in prison, for goodness sakes. They're bailed under certain conditions, which is using the concept or the technical concept of, if you go to a court and you don't do what you're told, there's a thing called contempt of court if you don't follow the court orders. Now, the type of arrests that they're doing, they're arresting people arbitrarily, in my view, but before it gets to court, before the matter has been decided in a court of law, they're already placing control orders on these people before their guilt, assuming there is any, has been established. And so they'll bail on a condition, and that's the use of the technicality of contempt. It's being now used at ground level by the police, and it's nothing more than a device to crush dissent. And I doubt if these matters are brought to court, an independent court of law, that the police will win. And I hope that many people do take these matters to court and show that these acts against them have been, in my view, unlawful. So to me, this clearly demonstrates the the acts against the British treatment of the lockdown protesters is politically motivated. The rule of law means that all are treated equally under the law. Everybody is treated equally under the law, applies the same to person A, B, C, and so on. So the rule of law, in my view, in Australia, and in all areas where once sovereign governments existed, have surrendered their powers to the globalist cabal. To prevent this ever occurring again, the definition of an emergency must be tightened considerably. Vague definitions won't do here anymore. Emergency powers can only be instituted on a month-by-month basis, and each extension requires a full vote of the entire body politic, and each politician there can go and justify to their constituents why they voted in a certain way. And this must include the approval of the federal government. You just can't have cowboys in the state government legislature, or cowgirls, doing these sort of things and getting away with it. They must be held accountable to the law. Many see this lockdown business just another globalist orchestrated act of destruction of the Western nation states. And you know what? They may be right. This is Tacitus Today, your pushback channel. Thank you for listening, and look out for our next video.